The shovel struck bone on the third swing. In the autumn of 1892, what started as a simple fence repair on Granville Sutherland's property became the discovery that would unravel 20 years of carefully buried secrets. This is the story of how an entire community chose silence over safety, and how that choice fed something far more sinister than anyone dared imagine. The hills of Millbrook County stretched like sleeping giants across western Pennsylvania, their slopes thick with oak and maple that turned blood red each October. The sound of axes rang through morning mist. The scent of wood smoke and rich earth filled the air. The ground itself felt solid, dependable, until you knew what lay beneath it. Granville Sutherland had lived on Birch Ridge for 37 years, long enough to remember when the Carrington family first arrived. They'd appeared one gray morning in 1871, their wagon loaded with furniture and children, claiming they'd purchased the old Morrison homestead from a cousin back east. Lucius Carrington walked with a limp and spoke in measured tones. His wife, Philomena, kept her eyes downcast and her voice soft. Their 3 sons, tall, broad-shouldered boys, who worked without complaint, helped establish them as model neighbors within a month. Police report, October 15th, 1892. Property owner G. Sutherland reports discovery of human remains during fence construction. Skeletal remains appear to have been buried deliberately. Depth suggests interment occurred multiple years ago. The Carringtons were helpful. When Irving Dean's barn burned down in 1874, Lucius and his boys rebuilt it without asking for payment. When Nellie Hathaway fell ill that same winter, Philomena brought soup and tended her children. When Cyrus Marshall's prize bull broke loose, the Carrington boys tracked it down in a blizzard and returned it unharmed. But Granville had begun noticing things, small things, like how the family never seemed to run short of meat, even during the harsh winter of 1876, when most families rationed carefully. How they always volunteered to help search for missing travelers, though they never seemed to find anything. How their property, a full section of prime bottomland, never showed signs of the livestock that should have supported such generous neighbors. Every community has families that others depend on. The Carringtons had become that family, the ones you called when trouble struck. But Granville wondered, what happened to the travelers who stopped at their door seeking shelter, only to disappear completely from local memory? The bones in his fence line were small, delicate, child-sized. What Granville didn't know yet was that this single discovery would expose a system of horror that had operated in plain sight for 2 decades, protected by gratitude and willful blindness. The Carrington family hadn't just made neighbors disappear, they'd made an entire community complicit in forgetting those neighbors had ever existed. Before we continue down this path, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Hit that like button if you're ready to uncover what really happened in those Pennsylvania hills, and make sure you're subscribed because this story gets much darker. But the real question isn't how the Carringtons managed to hide so many bodies. It's how they convinced an entire community to help them do it. Sheriff Phineas Webb arrived at the Sutherland property at 9:30 on October 16th, his boots crunching through frost-brittle leaves. The community's faith in law and order would be tested before the sunset that day. What Webb discovered in that fence line would force every family in Millbrook County to confront a terrifying question. How many missing people had they simply chosen to forget? The excavation site sprawled like an open wound across Granville's back pasture. The morning air carried the metallic tang of disturbed earth and something else, the sweet, cloying scent of decay that had seeped into the soil itself. Webb's fingers trembled as he brushed dirt from what appeared to be a child's rib cage, the bone yellowed with age but unmistakably human. Webb had served as county sheriff for 12 years, but nothing had prepared him for the systematic nature of what lay beneath that ridge. The remains weren't scattered or hastily buried. They were arranged, organized. each body placed with deliberate care in what appeared to be family groupings, adults flanking smaller forms, personal effects carefully preserved alongside the bones. Coroner's preliminary report, October 16th, 1892. Initial examination reveals minimum of 14 individual remains. Evidence suggests burials occurred over extended period, possibly spanning multiple years. Cause of death indeterminate due to skeletal condition. Dr. Merrick Underwood, the county coroner, arrived from Harrisburg on the afternoon train. A thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, he'd examined hundreds of bodies during his career. But even he paused when confronted with the methodical arrangement beneath Sutherland's property. The victims had been buried with their belongings, pocket watches, jewelry, children's toys, as if someone wanted them to be identifiable when eventually discovered. But that raised an uncomfortable question. If the Carringtons wanted the bodies found, why had it taken 21 years? The answer lay in the community itself. Webb began visiting neighbors, asking about missing travelers, about families who'd passed through and never arrived at their destinations. What he discovered was a pattern of collective amnesia that chilled him more than the autumn wind. Irving Dean, whose barn the Carringtons had rebuilt, claimed he couldn't recall any missing travelers. "Folks come and go," he said, avoiding Webb's eyes. "Roads dangerous, could be anywhere by now." Nellie Hathaway, whom Philomena had nursed through illness, insisted she'd never heard tell of anyone going missing. "The Carringtons are Christian people," she said firmly. "They've helped more families than I can count. Terror hides in plain sight." But Webb pressed harder. He visited the general store, where traveling merchants would have stopped for supplies. He checked the church registry, where visiting families might have signed in. He examined the toll records from the bridge crossing, looking for patterns in who entered the county versus who left. The numbers didn't match. Between 1871 and 1892, 47 wagons had crossed into Millbrook County and registered with the toll keeper. Only 31 had registered leaving. 16 families, 63 people in total, had simply vanished from official record. When Webb presented this evidence to the town council, they responded with uncomfortable silence. Councilman Josiah Stanhope finally spoke. "Sheriff, people change their minds, take different routes. You can't assume the worst just because paperwork doesn't line up." But Webb had found something else in his investigation, something that made his blood run cold. Every single missing family had been traveling with children. Every single family had stopped to ask directions to the Carrington property, where Lucius was known to trade in livestock and farm equipment. The pattern was perfect. Too perfect. Webb realized he wasn't just investigating murder. He was investigating a community's willful participation in making inconvenient people disappear. The grateful families, the rebuilt barns, the nursing care, the found livestock, it had all been payment. The Carringtons hadn't just bought silence. They'd bought active cooperation in erasing their victims from memory. What would you do if your child's life had been saved by someone you suspected of unspeakable crimes? Would you ask questions, or would you convince yourself that your suspicions were just paranoid thoughts? As Webb stood in that excavated field, watching Dr. Underwood catalog bone fragments by lamplight, he understood that the real horror wasn't just what the Carringtons had done. It was how easily an entire community had become complicit in helping them do it, one small favor at a time. But the sheriff had no idea that his investigation was about to uncover evidence that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the nature of evil itself. Sheriff Webb's boots echoed across the Carrington porch at dawn on October 17th. Each footstep deliberate as a judge's gavel. Behind the lace curtains, shadows moved with the careful precision of people who'd been expecting this visit for 21 years. This confrontation would reveal how predators use gratitude as both weapon and shield, turning their victims' own community into unwitting accomplices. The Carrington homestead sat like a monument to prosperity in the valley's heart. The scent of fresh-baked bread drifted from the kitchen windows. The sound of chickens clucking in well-maintained coops suggested normalcy. The porch boards felt solid beneath Webb's feet, painted white, and swept clean the home of people who took pride in appearances. Lucius Carrington answered the door before Webb could knock. At 62, he remained an imposing figure, despite his pronounced limp, his gray beard neatly trimmed, and his clothes pressed. Behind him stood Philomena, her hands folded and her expression serene. Their 3 sons, now grown, men in their 20s and 30s, flanked the parlor entrance like sentries. "Sheriff Webb," Lucius said, his voice carrying the measured tone that had charmed neighbors for decades. "We heard about poor Granville's discovery. Terrible business, finding those remains. How can we help?" Webb studied the man's face, searching for cracks in the facade. "Funny thing about those remains, Lucius. Dr. Underwood says they've been in the ground for years. Different times, different depths. Like someone was using that ridge as a burial ground." Township records: 1,871, 1,892. The Carrington family paid property taxes on 160 acres, but never registered livestock holdings, despite claiming to raise cattle and hogs. No sales receipts found in county records. Philomena stepped forward, her voice soft as spring rain. "Sheriff, we've lived here peacefully for over 20 years. Our boys work hard. We help our neighbors. We attend church regular. What are you suggesting?" But Webb had spent the previous night reviewing every favor the Carringtons had performed, every act of kindness that had earned them community protection. The pattern was unmistakable. Irving Dean's barn fire had happened 3 days after a family of German immigrants stopped at the Carrington house seeking directions. Nellie Hathaway fell ill the week after a traveling preacher and his wife visited the property. Cyrus Marshall's bull broke loose. During the same month, a merchant family from Ohio went missing. Each tragedy was followed by Carrington assistance. Each act of kindness created a debt that made questions unthinkable. Webb pulled out his notebook. "Lucius, I've been going through the toll records. A lot of families came through here over the years. A lot of them asked directions to your place specifically. Seems you had quite a reputation for helping travelers." Lucius nodded gravely. "We always tried to be hospitable. The road can be dangerous, especially in winter. We've given shelter to many folks over the years." "That's what I'm curious about," Webb said. "See, I can find records of these families arriving in the county, but I can't find records of them leaving. 47 wagons came through, but only 31 left. That's 16 families, Lucius. 63 people who just disappeared." The silence stretched like a held breath. Good neighbors don't ask questions. The youngest Carrington son, barely 25, shifted uncomfortably. Webb noticed how his hands were scarred old burns, cuts, the kind of marks that came from hard work with tools, or from handling things that fought back. "People change their plans," Philomena said quietly. "Take different routes, decide to settle elsewhere. You can't blame us for every traveler who chose a different path." But Webb had found something else during his investigation, something that made his skin crawl. He'd visited the general store and discovered that the Carringtons regularly purchased unusual quantities of lime, salt, and lamp oil, enough to preserve large quantities of meat, far more than any family should need for normal household use. More disturbing still, they'd bought children's clothing, lots of it in various sizes, always paying cash and always claiming it was for charity work. But Webb had checked with every church and charitable organization in 3 counties. None of them had any record of receiving donations from the Carrington family. Webb leaned forward. "Lucius, I need to search your property, your outbuildings, your cellars, your storage areas. I've got reason to believe those remains on Sutherland's land might be connected to missing travelers." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lucius smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Of course, Sheriff. We have nothing to hide, but I hope you understand. We've built a lot of goodwill in this community, helped a lot of families through hard times. People remember kindness." It was a threat wrapped in silk, and Webb felt its weight. He knew that half the families in Millbrook County owed the Carringtons favors. He knew that questioning the family meant questioning the judgment of everyone who'd accepted their help. He knew that an investigation might destroy more than just the Carringtons. But as Webb looked around that perfect parlor at the fine furniture, the expensive carpets, the family portrait showing 3 generations of prosperity, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything in this house had been paid for with blood. The search would begin within the hour, but Webb had no idea that what he was about to discover would force him to confront a truth far more horrifying than simple murder. Sometimes evil survives, not by hiding, but by making itself indispensable to the very people it preys upon. The cellar door groaned open at 11:47 a.m., releasing air that had been trapped underground for decades. Sheriff Webb's lantern illuminated stone steps, descending into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. This descent would reveal how the Carringtons had transformed simple hospitality into a carefully orchestrated system of horror, one guest at a time. The basement stretched beneath the entire Carrington house, its stone walls weeping moisture that carried the metallic scent of old iron. The sound of dripping water echoed from unseen corners. The floor felt uneven beneath Webb's boots, worn smooth by years of foot traffic in patterns that suggested regular use. What he found there would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces scarred by countless cuts and stained with substances that had darkened the wood permanently. Above them, hooks hung from the ceiling, beams dozens of them, arranged with the methodical precision of a professional butcher's shop. But these hooks were sized for larger game than any farmer should need. Dr. Underwood descended behind Webb, his medical bag clutched tight against his chest. "Sweet, merciful God," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the dripping. Along the far wall, they discovered what appeared to be a root cellar, its shelves lined with ceramic crocks and glass jars. But the contents weren't vegetables or preserves. Evidence log. October 17th, 1892. Basement search reveals extensive collection of personal effects, including pocket watches, jewelry, children's toys, and clothing. Items appear to have been cataloged and organized by family groupings. Each jar bore a paper label written in Philomena's careful script. Names, dates, and brief descriptions that read like a merchant's inventory. Thompson family, August 1874, 4 members, good condition. Muller children, September 1876, twin boys, ages 6 and 8. Widow Morrison and daughter, March 1881, traveling to relatives in Pittsburgh. Webb's hands shook as he read label after label, each one representing lives that had been reduced to bookkeeping entries. The jars themselves contained personal effects, wedding rings, spectacles, children's shoes, locks of hair tied with ribbon, trophies, Webb realized. Memorials to victims whose names had been systematically erased from community memory. But the most disturbing discovery lay behind a false wall that Dr. Underwood accidentally triggered when he leaned against what appeared to be a solid stone surface. The hidden chamber beyond revealed the true scope of the Carrington operation. The room was larger than the main cellar, its walls lined with wooden bins, like those used for storing grain. But these bins contained clothing, sorted by size and season. Men's work shirts, women's traveling dresses, children's winter coats, all cleaned, mended, and folded with care. The quantity suggested decades of accumulation. Death was a family business. In the center of the hidden room sat a massive table, its surface polished to a mirror shine. Leather restraints were bolted to its edges, and channels carved into the wood directed fluids toward drains in the floor. This wasn't the work of madmen, Webb realized. This was the workspace of craftsmen who took pride in their efficiency. A leather-bound ledger lay open on a side table, its pages filled with Lucius Carrington's meticulous handwriting. Unlike Philomena's simple labels, this book contained detailed records of each victim's arrival, processing, and disposal. Names, physical descriptions, estimated value of possessions, and notes about which neighbors might benefit from subsequent gifts of assistance. The entries read like a businessman's accounting records. Heinrich family. Wagon wheel repair led them here after we loosened bolts 2 miles out. 4 adults, 2 children. Philomena's soup worked within the hour. Johann fought briefly, but others submitted. Meat quality excellent, stored in north bins. Distributed gifts to Dean, barn timber, Hathaway, medical supplies, Marshall harness leather. Community gratitude secured for winter months. Webb felt bile rise in his throat as he realized the full scope of the operation. The Carringtons hadn't just been killing travelers. They'd been using their deaths to systematically buy influence and silence throughout Millbrook County. Every act of kindness had been funded by murder. Every favor had been payment for willful blindness. Dr. Underwood discovered something even more chilling. In a corner cabinet, detailed anatomical drawings showing optimal butchering techniques for human remains. The illustrations were precise, clinical, accompanied by notes about preservation methods and which cuts provided the best yield. Someone had studied this process with scientific dedication. "Sheriff," Underwood called, his voice strained, "you need to see this." He pointed to a collection of small bones arranged on a shelf like specimens. "These are from children, very young children, and they've been processed with the same care as the adults." Webb closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. The Carringtons hadn't just committed murder, they'd industrialized it. They'd turned human slaughter into a cottage industry that funded their standing in the community, while systematically eliminating anyone who might expose them. But as horrifying as these discoveries were, Webb sensed they still hadn't found the worst of it. The ledger contained references to a special room and mentioned select neighbors who knew more than they admitted. Some members of the community hadn't just accepted Carrington generosity, they'd actively participated in the horror. The question wasn't just how many people the Carringtons had killed, but how many neighbors had helped them do it, and what price they'd been willing to pay for the privilege of looking the other way. Sheriff Webb's arrest warrant crackled like autumn leaves as he unfolded it outside the Carrington house at 2:15 p.m. The document would expose a conspiracy that reached far deeper into Millbrook County than anyone had dared imagine. This confrontation would reveal how ordinary people become monsters, not through sudden violence, but through 1,000 small compromises that erode the soul one favor at a time. The afternoon air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. The sound of approaching horses echoed from the county road as Webb's deputies arrived to assist with the arrests. The porch boards creaked under the weight of armed men, but inside the house, the Carringtons waited with the calm of people who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Lucius Carrington surrendered without resistance, extending his hands for the shackles as if he were accepting communion. Philomena gathered her shawl and kissed each of her sons goodbye, whispering something in their ears that made them nod solemnly. The 3 young men, hardened by years of unspeakable work, submitted to arrest with the same mechanical compliance they'd shown in everything else. But Webb's investigation had uncovered something that chilled him more than the cellar discoveries. The Carringtons hadn't worked alone. County Prosecutor's Notes, October 18th, 1892. Evidence suggests systematic cooperation between Carrington family and multiple community members. Investigate possible charges of conspiracy and accessory to murder. The ledger Webb had found contained a separate section labeled Special Arrangements, a list of neighbors who had provided more than just silence in exchange for Carrington generosity. These weren't passive bystanders who'd chosen to ignore suspicious activity. These were active participants who'd helped identify targets, provided alibis, and even assisted with disposal. Irving Dean's name appeared 17 times in the Special Arrangements section. According to Lucius's meticulous records, Dean had steered vulnerable travelers toward the Carrington property, telling them about the family's legendary hospitality and recommending they stop for the night. In exchange, Dean received not just barn materials, but also advance warning about which families carried valuable goods worth stealing. Flora Cromwell, the postmistress, had intercepted mail meant for missing travelers, destroying letters that might have triggered outside investigations when families failed to arrive at their destinations. Her payment came in the form of rare medicines for her chronically ill husband medicines that no rural postmistress should have been able to afford. Josiah Stanhope, the town councilman who dismissed Webb's concerns about missing travelers, had actively discouraged official investigations whenever families inquired about missing relatives. The ledger revealed that Stanhope had received payments totaling over $800 across 15 years, a fortune that dwarfed his modest councilman's salary. Some secrets poison entire communities. But the most shocking discovery concerned Dr. Merrick Underwood himself. According to the ledger, the coroner had falsified death certificates for 3 Carrington victims, claiming they died of natural causes during their stay rather than acknowledging signs of violence. In exchange, he'd received not just money, but also access to fresh cadavers for his medical research bodies that no one would ever think to claim or question. Webb confronted Underwood as the doctor packed his medical equipment outside the Carrington house. "Merrick, I found your name in their records. Multiple entries. Want to explain why the county coroner was taking payments from suspected murderers?" Underwood's face went white as fresh snow. "Sheriff, you don't understand the pressures I was under. My research required specimens, and the state didn't provide nearly enough for proper study. The Carringtons offered a solution that benefited medical science." "Medical science?" Webb's voice rose. "They were butchering families, Merrick. Children, pregnant women, elderly folks, just trying to reach relatives. And you helped them cover it up for corpses to dissect?" The doctor's hands trembled as he closed his bag. "Those people were already dead when I saw them. I didn't kill anyone. I just didn't ask too many questions about how they died." Webb realized he was looking at the heart of the Carrington operation's success. They hadn't relied on fear or threats to maintain community silence. They'd systematically identified what each neighbor needed: most money, materials, medicine, professional advancement, and used murder to provide it. They turned an entire town into accomplices by making themselves indispensable. Sarah Edgerton, who ran the general store, had ordered unusual quantities of lime and salt on behalf of the Carringtons, never questioning why a family needed industrial amounts of preservation materials. Cyrus Marshall had provided false testimony about the timing of travelers passing through, giving the Carringtons alibis when families went missing. Even Reverend Lenora Hollingsworth had participated, refusing to hold memorial services for missing travelers because we can't mourn people who might simply have changed their plans. Each participant had justified their cooperation through small lies and moral compromises. They told themselves they were just being helpful neighbors. They convinced themselves that asking questions would be rude or suspicious. They rationalized their payments as legitimate compensation for services rendered. But Webb understood the truth. The Carringtons had created a murder machine powered by human greed and community-wide denial. As he loaded the family into wagons for transport to the county jail, Webb counted 23 community members whose names appeared in the conspiracy ledger. Nearly half the adult population of Millbrook County had knowingly participated in systematic murder, and most of them were still walking free, still maintaining their facade of respectability. The arrests had ended the killing, but they'd only begun to expose the true scope of corruption that had infected an entire community like gangrene. Webb didn't yet know that the Carringtons' final secret would force him to question whether justice was even possible when evil had become so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that removing it might destroy the community itself. The courthouse bell tolled 9 times on October 24th as Millbrook County faced its day of judgment. Inside the packed courtroom, 23 of the county's most respected citizens sat in wooden chairs, waiting to learn whether complicity in mass murder carried the same penalty as pulling the trigger. This trial would force an entire community to confront a question that haunts us still. How many atrocities can good people enable before they stop being good people at all? The Westmoreland County Courthouse reeked of nervous sweat and tobacco smoke. The sound of shuffling feet echoed from the gallery as farmers, shopkeepers, and town officials packed every available seat. The polished oak floors creaked under the weight of a community watching itself being dissected in public. Prosecutor Franklin Hayes had traveled from Pittsburgh specifically for this case, bringing with him a reputation for ruthless cross-examination and an absolute intolerance for moral cowardice. Hayes opened his case with the Carrington Ledger, reading entry after entry in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Each name he spoke, Heinrich, Thompson, Mueller, Morrison, seemed to hang in the air like an accusation. The gallery grew quieter with each victim, until the only sound was the scratch of the court reporter's pen and the occasional sob from family members who'd never known what happened to their missing relatives. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Hayes began, "you will hear the defense claim that these good people were merely neighbors helping neighbors. You will hear testimony about barn raisings and charity work, about medicine provided to the sick, and shelter offered to the weary. But I ask you to remember this. Every act of kindness performed by the accused was paid for with innocent blood." Trial transcript, Commonwealth versus Carrington et al., October 24th, 1892. Defense motion to sever trials denied. Court finds sufficient evidence of conspiracy to warrant joint prosecution of all 26 defendants. The first witness called was Irving Dean, the man whose barn the Carringtons had rebuilt with materials purchased through murder. Dean took the stand wearing his best Sunday suit, his weathered hands shaking as he placed them on the Bible. Under Hayes's questioning, he admitted to steering 17 families toward the Carrington property over 12 years, always with glowing recommendations about their hospitality. "Mr. Dean," Hayes asked, "did you ever wonder why travelers who stopped at the Carrington house were never seen leaving?" Dean's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I figured they took different roads, maybe headed south instead of east. Roads can be confusing to strangers. Confusing enough that 63 people over 20 years all chose routes that bypassed every other settlement between here and their destinations." Dean had no answer. Hayes methodically called witness after witness, each conspiracy member forced to explain their participation in their own words. Flora Cromwell wept as she described destroying mail meant for missing families. Josiah Stanhope's voice cracked when he admitted discouraging official investigations. Dr. Underwood sat rigid as a corpse when confronted with falsified death certificates bearing his signature. Justice demands an accounting, but the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Susan Spencer, Irving Dean's 16-year-old daughter, who'd been helping with barn repairs, when she overheard her father and Lucius Carrington discussing their arrangement. "I heard Mr. Carrington tell my father that the German family had more gold than they'd expected," Susan testified, her young voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "He said my father's share would be enough to fix the barn and buy seed for spring planting. Then he laughed and said the family wouldn't be needing their wagon anymore." Hayes leaned forward. "Miss Spencer, what did your father say in response?" He asked if there were any children in the family. When Mr. Carrington said yes, 2 little boys, my father was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Make it quick for the young ones. They don't deserve to suffer for their parents' bad luck." The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Morrison banged his gavel for order, but the damage was done. The community had heard, in a child's innocent words, how casually their neighbors had discussed the murder of families. The defense attorney, a tired-looking man named William Thornton, attempted to portray his clients as victims of Carrington manipulation. He argued that the family had preyed on desperate people during hard times, offering solutions to problems that seemed insurmountable. Barn fires, sick children, failed crops, all the ordinary tragedies of rural life had become opportunities for the Carringtons to expand their network of complicit neighbors. "My clients are guilty of weakness," Thornton argued, "guilty of accepting help when they needed it most, guilty of not asking questions when the answers might have been more than they could bear. But they are not guilty of murder." Hayes stood for his rebuttal with the controlled fury of a prosecutor who'd spent weeks cataloging human remains. "Members of the jury, the defense would have you believe that good people can accidentally participate in the systematic slaughter of 63 innocent souls. They would have you believe that moral blindness is a reasonable defense for 20 years of enabling mass murder." He gestured toward the evidence table, where personal effects from dozens of victims lay tagged and cataloged. "These are not the belongings of people who died of natural causes. These are trophies taken from families who trusted their neighbors to help them find shelter, food, and safety. Instead, they found death because an entire community chose comfort over conscience." The trial had exposed not just the Carrington murders, but the systematic moral rot that had infected Millbrook County. Every defendant had made choices, small choices, individual choices, that collectively enabled industrial-scale horror. But Hayes had saved his most damning evidence for last. The final revelation would destroy any remaining illusions about the scope of community participation and force the jury to confront a truth that would haunt the county for generations. Some of the victims hadn't been random travelers at all, but local residents whose disappearances had been carefully orchestrated by their own neighbors. Prosecutor Hayes lifted a familiar photograph at 3:47 p.m., and every person in the courtroom recognized the face staring back at them. The woman in the tintype had lived among them, worked beside them, prayed with them every Sunday, until the day her own neighbors decided she was worth more dead than alive. This revelation would shatter the last illusion that the Carrington conspiracy had only targeted strangers, exposing how evil can turn a community's most trusted relationships into instruments of murder. The photograph showed Maud Vanderbilt, a widowed seamstress who'd lived on Elm Street for 8 years before disappearing in the spring of 1887. The courtroom air grew thick with recognition and horror. The sound of shifting bodies filled the silence as neighbors who'd claimed ignorance about missing travelers suddenly realized they were looking at someone they'd helped kill. The wooden pews creaked under the weight of collective guilt as Hayes prepared to destroy their final refuge of denial. Maud had been no stranger passing through. She'd been their neighbor, their friend, the woman who'd sewn wedding dresses for their daughters and burial clothes for their dead. She'd lived 3 blocks from the courthouse, where her murderers now sat in judgment, and every person in that room had attended her supposed funeral 5 years earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes announced, "I present evidence that the conspiracy extended beyond robbing travelers. The defendants systematically targeted members of their own community, people who trusted them, people who considered them friends." Evidence item 47. Personal correspondence found in Carrington residence dated March 15, 1887. MV, becoming suspicious about missing Peterson family. Asking too many questions at church social. Philomena suggests invitation to Easter dinner might solve problem permanently. Hayes read from a letter found in Philomena Carrington's sewing basket, written in Maud Vanderbilt's own hand to her sister in Philadelphia. The letter, never sent, described her growing concerns about families who'd vanished after visiting the Carrington property. Maud had been conducting her own investigation, tracking down relatives of missing people and comparing stories about their planned routes and final destinations. "I fear something terrible has happened to the Peterson children," Maud had written. "They were such sweet little ones, and Mrs. Peterson spoke so fondly of the Easter dress she wanted me to make for little Mary. But they never arrived at their sister's house in Pittsburgh, and the Carringtons claim they never stopped here at all. Someone is lying, and I intend to discover who." Maud Vanderbilt had stumbled onto the truth that an entire community had chosen to ignore. Her crime wasn't being a stranger in need of shelter, it was being a neighbor with a conscience. Hayes called Irving Dean back to the witness stand, his face pale as morning frost. Under oath, Dean admitted that he'd been present when the conspiracy members discussed the Maud problem during a barn raising in March of 1887. "Lucius said she was asking dangerous questions," Dean testified, his voice barely audible. "Said she'd been writing letters to families in other counties, trying to trace missing people. He said if she kept digging, she'd bring federal investigators down on all of us." "What solution did Mr. Carrington propose?" Hayes asked. Dean's hands trembled as he spoke. "He said Maud was lonely since her husband died. Said Philomena should invite her for Easter dinner, make her feel like part of the family. Then he said we'd never have to worry about her questions again. Local trust becomes local terror." The conspiracy members had voted on Maud's death like it was a town ordinance. 12 neighbors had agreed that murdering a seamstress was preferable to risking exposure of their crimes. They'd used her own loneliness, her need for community connection after losing her husband to lure her to her death. Hayes produced Maud's sewing basket, found in the Carrington cellar alongside her carefully preserved personal effects. Inside were unfinished projects for half the families in Millbrook County, a baby blanket for the Spencer infant, alterations for Flora Cromwell's Sunday dress, patches for Irving Dean's work clothes. The woman they'd killed had been in the middle of serving the very community that decided she needed to die. Maud Vanderbilt wasn't the only local victim, Hayes continued, producing a second set of evidence. The conspiracy also targeted Thomas Quincy, the traveling preacher who'd been asking questions about missing parishioners. They murdered Sarah Morrison, whose property they wanted for expansion. They killed elderly Benjamin Forbes when he threatened to report suspicious activities to state authorities. Each revelation hit the gallery like a physical blow. These weren't faceless strangers who'd chosen the wrong road. These were neighbors, friends, people who trusted their community enough to voice concerns about missing travelers. Their reward for civic responsibility had been systematic elimination. The defense had no response. How do you argue self-defense when the victims were people asking reasonable questions about disappeared families? How do you claim justification when the murders were committed to protect a criminal enterprise that had already claimed dozens of innocent lives? Hayes approached the jury box for his final argument about local victims. "Members of the jury, you've heard testimony about travelers murdered for their possessions. But these local killings reveal the true character of the conspiracy. These defendants didn't just kill for money, they killed to protect their ability to keep killing. They murdered their own neighbors to preserve a system of horror that enriched them all." He gestured toward the evidence table, now crowded with personal effects from both travelers and locals. Maud Vanderbilt died because she cared enough about missing children to ask uncomfortable questions. Thomas Quincy died because he refused to stop looking for missing members of his congregation. These people died because they possessed the moral courage that every defendant in this courtroom abandoned years ago. As Hayes returned to his seat, the courtroom sat in stunned silence. The community had been forced to confront the ultimate betrayal. Their most trusted neighbors had systematically eliminated anyone who threatened to expose their crimes. turning friendship itself into a weapon of murder. But the prosecutor had saved one final revelation for the next day, evidence that would prove the conspiracy hadn't ended with the arrests, and that some members of the community were still working to protect the killers, even as their victims' bones cried out for justice. Sheriff Webb found the threatening note nailed to his front door at midnight. Its message written in the same careful script that had cataloged 20 years of murder. Even with the Carringtons in jail, their network of protectors was still working to ensure that justice would never be served. This discovery would prove that evil doesn't die. With the arrest of its architects, it survives in the hearts of those who profited from it and will kill again to protect their investments. The October air bit through Webb's nightshirt as he stood on his porch, lantern in hand, reading words that made his blood freeze. The scent of fierce sweat, mixed with autumn decay, drifted from his own skin. The sound of his heartbeat thundered in his ears as he realized the conspiracy was far from over. The porch boards felt unsteady beneath his feet, as if the very foundation of law and order in Millbrook County was crumbling. Sheriff Webb, the note read, in Philomena Carrington's distinctive handwriting, "You have stirred up matters that were better left buried. Certain arrangements have been made to ensure the trial does not proceed as planned. Consider this a kindness. We could have chosen a more permanent solution to our mutual problem." Webb knew that Philomena was locked in a cell 30 miles away, which meant someone else was continuing her work, someone with access to her personal papers, someone who knew the conspiracy's inner workings well enough to forge her script and duplicate her threats. The network of complicit neighbors hadn't disbanded with the arrests. They'd simply gone underground. County Sheriff's Daily Log, October 25th, 1892. Discovered evidence of ongoing intimidation campaign against trial witnesses. Suspect organized effort to obstruct justice through threats and bribery. Requesting additional security for courthouse proceedings. Webb had been receiving reports all week about suspicious activities around town. Potential witnesses were being approached by concerned neighbors who reminded them about all the good the accused had done for the community. Jurors were finding anonymous gifts on their doorsteps. Fresh meat, bottles of whiskey, envelopes containing more cash than most farmers saw in a year. The message was clear. Loyalty to the conspiracy would be rewarded, while cooperation with prosecution would be punished. 3 key witnesses had already recanted their testimony. Mary Hutchinson, who'd seen Irving Dean directing travelers toward the Carrington property, suddenly claimed she'd been mistaken about the dates. Samuel Porter, who'd helped Flora Cromwell destroy mail, developed convenient memory problems about which letters he'd burned. Even young Susan Spencer, whose testimony about overhearing murder plans had devastated the defense, was now claiming she'd misunderstood what she'd heard. The conspiracy wasn't just defending itself. It was actively consuming evidence and witnesses like a fire eating oxygen. Webb discovered the scope of the intimidation campaign when he visited the Spencer household to check on Susan's safety. Irving Dean's daughter met him at the door with fresh bruises on her arms and terror in her eyes. Behind her, Webb could see her father pacing the parlor like a caged animal. "She's not changing her story because she wants to," Irving Dean admitted when Webb confronted him. "But you don't understand the pressure we're under, Sheriff. People are saying if the trial continues, it'll destroy the whole county, bring in federal investigators, outside authorities. They're saying folks who cooperate with the prosecution will be marked as traitors." "Who's saying that, Irving?" Webb demanded. "Who's threatening a 16-year-old girl?" Dean's face went white. "I can't tell you that, but they've got money, Sheriff. More money than the Carringtons ever had. And they're not afraid to use it. Some roots run too deep." Webb realized he was fighting not just a murder conspiracy, but an entire shadow economy built on 20 years of blood money. The Carringtons had distributed wealth throughout the community, creating financial dependencies that outlasted their freedom. Neighbors who'd received payments, materials, and favors now faced economic ruin if the full scope of the conspiracy was exposed. The general store was struggling because Flora Cromwell's arrest had revealed years of false inventory records used to hide conspiracy purchases. The church was facing bankruptcy because Reverend Hollingsworth's participation had tainted donation records that might be seized as evidence. Even the school was threatened because the teacher, it turned out, had been paid with money stolen from murdered families. Hayes discovered the financial web when he examined bank records from 3 neighboring counties. Over 2 decades, the conspiracy had generated an estimated $12,000 in stolen wealth, an astronomical fortune that had been systematically laundered through legitimate businesses and community projects. The new church bell, the schoolhouse expansion, the bridge repairs that had made Millbrook County prosperous, all of it had been funded by systematic murder. Exposing the full truth wouldn't just destroy 26 individuals. It would bankrupt an entire community and expose the moral rot that had infected every institution in the county. Webb found evidence of the ongoing conspiracy when he searched Irving Dean's barn for the second time. Hidden beneath hay bales, he discovered meeting minutes from gatherings that had occurred after the arrests. The documents revealed that 12 conspiracy members still at large had been meeting weekly to coordinate their response to the trial. They'd established a defense fund using money stolen from victims. They'd hired investigators to dig up dirt on prosecution witnesses. They'd even attempted to bribe Judge Morrison, offering him a judgeship in Pittsburgh if he would declare a mistrial based on procedural irregularities. The most chilling discovery was a list titled Final Solutions, names of potential witnesses and jurors, marked for elimination if legal intimidation failed. Webb's own name appeared at the top, followed by Prosecutor Hayes and Dr. Underwood. The conspiracy was prepared to commit new murders to cover up old ones. Webb sat in his office that night, staring at evidence that proved the Carrington network was still operational, still dangerous, still willing to kill to protect their secrets. He realized that arresting the family had been like cutting the head off a hydra. 2 new threats had emerged for every one eliminated. The trial would conclude the next day, but Webb knew that regardless of the verdict, the real conspiracy would continue. Too many people had too much to lose, too much blood on their hands, too much money in their pockets. The Carringtons had created a monster that would outlive them all. As Webb locked the evidence in his safe, he wondered if justice was even possible when an entire community had become complicit in evil, and when that complicity had become the foundation of their prosperity. Even today, locals say that on foggy October nights, you can still hear the sound of wagon wheels on the old Millbrook County roads. Travelers who never learned that some neighbors can't be trusted, no matter how helpful they seem. The verdict came down at 4:22 p.m. on October 26th, and with it, the terrible realization that some truths are too large for any courtroom to contain. Judge Morrison's gavel fell like a coffin nail, sealing not just the fate of 26 defendants, but the soul of an entire community. This final judgment would prove that even when evil is exposed and punished, its roots run so deep that justice itself becomes another casualty of the very crimes it seeks to address. The courthouse air hung thick with the weight of unspoken secrets as the jury foreman stood to deliver their decision. The scent of nervous sweat and tobacco had been replaced by something colder, the metallic smell of fear mixed with resignation. The sound of rustling papers echoed through the gallery as families of both victims and defendants waited to learn whether 20 years of systematic murder would receive the punishment it deserved. The wooden floors creaked under the shifting weight of a community that knew it would never be the same regardless of the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendants, Lucius Carrington, Philomena Carrington, and their 3 sons guilty of murder in the first degree. The foreman announced, his voice steady despite the magnitude of his words. We recommend death by hanging for all 5 defendants. The gallery erupted in a mixture of gasps, sobs, and scattered applause. But the relief was short-lived as the foreman continued reading. Regarding the remaining 21 defendants charged with conspiracy and accessory to murder, we find 14 guilty of conspiracy in the second degree, with sentences of 10 to 20 years imprisonment. We find 7 defendants not guilty by reason of insufficient evidence to prove knowledge of the murders. Final trial record: Commonwealth versus Carrington et al. Verdicts rendered October 26, 1892. Primary defendants sentenced to death. Conspiracy defendants received varying sentences. 7 defendants acquitted despite documented participation in criminal enterprise. Sheriff Webb felt his stomach drop as he realized what had happened. The jury had been compromised, not through bribery or threats, but through the same willful blindness that had enabled the murders in the first place. They'd chosen to believe that good neighbors could unknowingly participate in mass murder, that moral blindness was a reasonable defense for 20 years of complicity. Irving Dean walked free despite admitting to steering 17 families to their deaths. Flora Cromwell received only 5 years, despite destroying evidence of dozens of disappearances. Josiah Stanhope got 8 years, despite actively discouraging investigations. Dr. Underwood escaped with his medical license intact after Judge Morrison ruled that falsifying 3 death certificates didn't constitute sufficient evidence of ongoing conspiracy. The community had chosen partial justice over complete accountability, preserving the fiction that most of their neighbors were victims rather than accomplices. Hayes stood to address the court after sentencing, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "Your Honor, the Commonwealth has proven that this conspiracy involved systematic murder spanning 2 decades. We have documented evidence of 26 individuals participating in crimes that claimed at least 63 lives. Today's verdicts ensure that the architects of this horror will face justice, but they fail to address the network that enabled and profited from these crimes." Judge Morrison nodded gravely. "Mr. Hayes, this court recognizes that perfect justice is beyond our reach in this matter. The conspiracy you've exposed has roots too deep and branches too wide for any single trial to address completely. We must content ourselves with punishing the worst offenders and hope that this community has learned from its tragic failures." But Webb knew the community had learned the wrong lesson entirely. Some evils outlive their architects. The executions took place on December 15, 1892, before a crowd of nearly 500 spectators who'd traveled from across Pennsylvania to witness the end of the Carrington family. Lucius died without confession, maintaining his innocence to the final moment. Philomena whispered prayers in a language no one recognized. The 3 sons said nothing at all, accepting their fate with the same mechanical compliance they'd shown throughout their lives. But their deaths didn't end the conspiracy, they merely decapitated it. Within 6 months of the executions, 3 key prosecution witnesses had died under suspicious circumstances. Mary Hutchinson, who'd recanted her testimony about Irving Dean, was found drowned in her own well. Samuel Porter, who'd admitted to helping destroy mail, died in a barn fire that investigators ruled accidental despite evidence of arson. Young Susan Spencer, whose courage had exposed the scope of local participation, disappeared while walking to school one morning and was never seen again. Webb investigated each death, but the surviving conspiracy members had learned from the Carringtons' mistakes. No ledgers were kept. No evidence was preserved. Witnesses vanished without leaving traces that could be followed or explained. The network had evolved, becoming more careful but no less deadly. The Carrington property was sold at auction to pay legal costs, but no one would work the land. Crops planted there withered regardless of weather or care. Livestock sickened and died within weeks of grazing those fields. Eventually, the county abandoned the property to wilderness, letting the forest reclaim what human habitation had corrupted. Webb left Millbrook County in 1895, unable to continue serving a community that had chosen comfortable lies over difficult truths. He never spoke publicly about the case again, but those who knew him said he aged rapidly after the trial, as if the weight of unfinished justice had bent him toward the grave. The conspiracy's surviving members quietly rebuilt their influence over the following years. Irving Dean was elected to the town council in 1898. Flora Cromwell returned to her position as postmistress after serving only 3 years of her sentence. Dr. Underwood continued practicing medicine until his death in 1921, taking with him secrets about falsified records that ensured many questions would never be answered. Millbrook County gradually recovered its reputation, but those who lived through the trials knew that something fundamental had been broken that could never be repaired. Trust became a luxury the community could no longer afford. Neighbors watched neighbors with suspicious eyes. Strangers were discouraged from stopping, warned away by locals who claimed the roads were dangerous and the hospitality poor. The truth had been exposed. Justice had been partially served, but evil had simply learned to hide more carefully in the spaces between community conscience and individual greed. As Webb packed his belongings for the final time, he found a note slipped under his door in Philomena Carrington's familiar script. "Sheriff, you have won this battle, but lost the war. We planted seeds in this soil that will grow long after our names are forgotten. Every act of kindness will be suspected. Every gesture of help will be questioned. You have not brought justice, you have brought eternal doubt." That is our final gift to Millbrook County. Webb burned the note without reading it to anyone else, but its message haunted him for the rest of his life. The Carringtons had achieved a final victory by destroying the very foundations of community trust that had once made their crimes possible. Today, the old Carrington property remains abandoned, though locals claim they sometimes see lights moving through the empty farmhouse windows on foggy October nights, as if someone is still cataloging and organizing the remnants of 20 years of systematic murder. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.